Immediately to my left is Eva Kreienkamp, who is the CEO of the BVG, the BVG, which is Berlin's public transport operator, and she's going to be speaking to us in a moment. And we also have Ross Douglas with us, the founder and CEO of Autonomy, which is the world's leading sustainable mobility network. So I'd like to ask Ross to start with a presentation that he has prepared for us.
Thank you, Sumi. Okay, so my name is Ross Douglas, and I'm going to talk about why we need to transition from being motorists to mobilists. And for me, the genesis of the idea really came when I went to Lagos to do an event for startups to pitch their ideas to VCs with a friend of mine who was Nigerian. And we've got these really interesting investors who came out from the States who were ex-Nigerians, and we had these great young Nigerian entrepreneurs. And every single entrepreneur would get asked the question, well, how will you move your goods from A to B? Because in Nigeria or in Lagos, there's absolutely almost zero mobility. And at the time, I was using a driver, which you do in Lagos, to move, and I averaged about 3 to 4 kilometers an hour. And I would commute for 2 to 3 hours to do a meeting, which was 4 or 5 kilometers away. And what is very clear to me is that as you keep adding cars into cities, you keep getting less and less mobility. And one of the few solutions people had, which doesn't really work, was that they would buy police lights from the police to try and push the other cars out the way with their flashing sirens. And that's how unbelievably constricted it became. So, I started understanding that increasing car ownership just really is a massive problem. So I, at the time, got all excited and moved to Paris in 2015 to create the world's first urban mobility event that was focused on post-car ownership. At the time, the biggest trend was amongst Europeans moving from normal motor cars to SUVs. So it was a completely premature idea. I lost my money and had to start again with new investors. But along the way, I've learned quite a lot. And what I want to talk to you today about is why we need to transition more from motorists to being mobilists as opposed to just from combustion to electric. So, let me go to the first slide. So obviously what's happening now in Europe is we've got Fit for 55, which is the EU's plan to halve carbon emissions by 2030 and go to carbon neutral by 2050. A big part of that plan is the banning of combustion vehicles from 2035. So the hope, obviously, is that we can radically reduce carbon emissions by converting from ICE, internal combustion engines, to electric vehicles. The problem is that only really reduces carbon emissions if you have 100% renewable energy. What we've learned due to the energy crisis now is that we don't have 100% renewable energy in Europe, and we are unlikely to have 100% renewable energy for a very long time. Energy is very difficult to create, particularly renewable energy. It takes time. And when you have big electric vehicles, which generally weigh 2 tons to move an 80-kilogram person, they just require a lot of energy to move that amount of mass. For the result of moving a person from A to B. There are other, obviously electric vehicles are called zero-emission vehicles, and while they are better on most occasions to combustion vehicles, there are other emissions that will become more and more problematic. The first one is tire emissions. So what is now being realized and discovered is that microparticles and microplastics going into the oceans, the most toxic part of that is from our tire emissions, what they call tire dust, particles that come off on the road, get washed down the rivers and into the sea, and they're super, super toxic, killing fish. What will happen in the future, obviously, is we'll have legislation to reduce those emissions, and that legislation will go against electric vehicle ownerships owners who have just been subsidized to buy electric vehicles. So that will be problematic. The other big problem, obviously, is that electric vehicles just require a massive amount of minerals to make the batteries. An electric vehicle has roughly half a ton of battery in order to give you the desired autonomy of 400 kilometers that most people feel they need to have an electric vehicle. This is a very beautiful photograph of a lithium mine in Chile. And with those lithium mines, what they do is they get the sludge of lithium, it evaporates, and it takes about 2.2 million liters of water to produce 1 ton of lithium. Obviously, as we go to a warming planet, we go to a water-scarce planet. The amount of lithium we produce today is not sufficient for the amount of electric vehicles we hope to make, and we need to increase the mining of lithium by 40 to 50 times of what it is today. So these are some of the externalities that we often don't think about just because obviously electric vehicles are zero-emission vehicles, but the emissions sit somewhere else. let's talk for a minute, not just about the environmental impact, but obviously the economic impact. What we obviously want to do as European taxpayers, I'm South African, but I live and pay tax in Europe, is we want our economies to do well, we want our employment to do well. And when we move to electric vehicles, we have to change the whole value chain. It's no longer about mechanical engineering, it's no longer about securing fossil fuels. It is all now about producing energy in a different way and storing that energy in the battery. And what we are seeing is that Europe is very, very far behind China in the critical minerals that are needed to make those batteries. So economically, every time you make an electric vehicle, roughly a third of that cost is in the battery, and 70, 80, 90% of that money is sent to China because they have the whole value chain of the batteries. That's a slide that demonstrates the point. Because there are three parts to making a battery. The first part is you've got to get the nickel, the cobalt, the graphite, the lithium out the ground. Happens in Australia, Africa, South America. Obviously, there's no mining in Europe. You then got to take that raw material and you've got to process it, which is a very dirty, energy expensive process, into oxides. That happens mainly in China. Literally 90% of the material is processed there. And then you send that to the gigafactories where they make the batteries. Like you have a gigafactory in Germany, Northvolt in Sweden, there's one in the UK going. And we, as Europeans, just have not invested in that value chain. So it's all in China. And obviously, when we go to renewable energy, we're going to need battery storage to store our energy. So for example, in Germany, you have about 40 million motor cars. If you converted all of those to electric vehicles, you would have at least 20 million tons of batteries sitting in vehicles. And those batteries could obviously be used to, keep the power on in schools and buildings and businesses, because batteries will become hugely valuable when we go across to renewable energy. This slide is really to talk about why we've got this idea so wrong. So that, this is what a lot of policymakers are looking at. They're saying, okay, how can we change the 1.8 billion vehicles on the planet from ICE vehicles to battery electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles? What I'll argue today, and it's very good to be sitting here with the head of BVG, is that we need to rather look at how to replace motor cars with other forms of mobility. And we need to look at how do you replace vehicles that are doing the most mileage from combustion to electric. There's not much point if I am doing, a daily commute of 5 kilometers a day, changing a combustion vehicle to an electric vehicle, because the emissions sit not in the driving of that vehicle, they sit in the manufacturing of that vehicle. And that vehicle is way underutilized. Electric vehicles generally last between 500 and 700,000 kilometers. Combustion's about 200. So combustion vehicles work quite well for the 10 to 12-year lifespan. Electric vehicles would last 20 to 25 years. So they're not really designed for single ownership. They're much better designed for professional use or for sharing use, where you can get the mileage up, because nobody wants to own a car that's 20 years old. So psychologically, instead of saying, wow, look, we can replace these 1.8 billion vehicles with electric vehicles, we should be saying, how do we convert combustion miles to electric miles, and how do we radically reduce car ownership and replace it with other forms of mobility? And this is the argument today. What this slide shows is that when you reduce car ownership, a whole lot of other businesses start up and start filling that space. They start jumping into the ecosystem, because obviously car ownership is a good door-to-door solution. And one of the reasons people do not want to lose their motor car is that it actually works really well from door to door. And there are not enough good alternatives to replace that motor car yet. But what is happening now is you have obviously mass transit at the base, the super important base of your transit. And now you have a whole lot of other private operators adding shared micromobility. Where is Europe leading in mobility? Europe is making the best, most sophisticated electric bikes in the world. And those electric bike companies, a lot of them are German, have absolutely blossomed. So you start getting a whole new ecosystem developing, which is very European. The money stays in Europe. It creates jobs. It's much more youthful, if I can put it that way. So, creating jobs for young people too. Those companies are often driven by young entrepreneurs. Very, very exciting companies. And that's also in the manufacturing of new light vehicles, the mobility shared services, the data, the software that sits behind it. So that is my conclusion. It's a short conclusion, but my argument, as you would understand, is that in order to truly reduce carbon emissions to within the level of 1.5 or 2 degrees, we cannot tinker and say, well, let's keep our relationship with motor cars the same. We have to radically reduce car ownership. In America today, the parking lots of America collectively add up to a space the size of Poland. That's how much infrastructure they've dedicated to car parking. The more car parks you have, the further away things are, the more you need a car to get to them because the car parks are taking up all the space. As you start getting warming cities and a warming planet, what you need to do is you need to take that black asphalt, which retains heat and holds heat. You need to put trees there, you need to put other stuff there because it just is a thermal mass that holds and retains heat. So what I believe will happen is that you'll start naturally getting a movement away from car ownership to motorist to mobilist. And what I believe is that European policymakers should understand this and really incentivize people to reduce car ownership and incentivize businesses like the great industrial businesses like Volkswagen to get more into the shared mobility services and new mobility services. And a final comment I'd like to finish on is that I believe we will start to see light autonomous vehicles on our streets, which will provide another very good way of moving that replaces the practicalities and the convenience of car ownership. Thank you.